Deep in a sunburnt corner of the frontier, where law was written in gunpowder and hope died with the last rain, a young widow made the most dangerous choice of her life. She opened her door to a starving, wounded stranger. But she didn't know that by offering shelter to an outlaw, she would change the fate of her farm and perhaps her own future. This is a story of courage, faith, and redemption, where even outlaws know how to protect what the world tried to destroy. The wind whispered like an old ghost, low, mournful, and relentless. It sang through the broken fields, through the hollowed-out cornstalks that rattled like bones, and through the gaps in the fence where cattle once grazed before the drought stole everything. Marianne Dorn pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her slender frame and stood at the edge of her property, surveying the wreckage. The soil, once fertile and full of promise, had turned to dust beneath her boots. The last harvest had come and gone, leaving her with barely enough grain to fill half a barrel. Another winter was coming, and she could already feel its sharp teeth in the evening breeze. She was 26 years old, but looked older now, her once bright eyes dulled by grief, her once strong hands scarred from years of hard labor. The death of her husband, Jacob, had left a hollow space inside her that no amount of work could fill. Still, she stayed. She stayed because the land was all she had left of him, this cracked, cursed piece of earth he had loved so fiercely. Most had abandoned their farms months ago, packing up what little they had and heading east in search of Kenderlands. Those who remained were either too stubborn, too poor, or too broken to leave. Eloise supposed she was a little of each. The sun dipped below the horizon, staining the sky a burnt orange. She picked up the worn basket she had used for gathering what few vegetables survived and trudged back toward the farmhouse, her boots dragging through the dust. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke and old wood. She bolted the door, checked the shutters, and threw 2 small logs into the iron stove. The fire sparked to life after a stubborn delay, casting a dim glow across the single room. Her cabin was worn and weary, a sagging bed in the corner, a battered table, a few handmade quilts, and a stack of letters tied neatly with twine. Letters from Jacob, written when he was away fighting a war that had stolen too many good men. She dropped into the lone rocking chair, knitting slow, methodical stitches to keep her mind from drifting to darker places. The crackle of the fire and the rhythmic scrape of needles were the only sounds, until something else broke the quiet. A faint sound, rough, strained, unfamiliar, coming from outside. Eloise stiffened. She set the knitting aside and reached for the hunting rifle mounted above the door. It was old, the barrel scratched and the stock worn smooth by years of use, but it still held a single shot. Enough, she hoped, to scare off whatever prowler had dared come so close. Moving carefully, she unlatched the door and stepped into the night. The wind hit her like a slap, cold and bitter. She moved quickly toward the barn, heart pounding, each step crunching over the frozen dirt. The barn door hung loose on its hinges, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the smell of hay, horses, and old sweat filled her nose. And there, beneath a pile of straw near the far wall, something moved. Eloise raised the rifle. "Who's there?" she called, her voice sharper than she felt. No answer, just another groan. Cautiously, she approached. The figure came into view. A man, crumpled and broken, sprawled across the ground like a rag doll discarded by a cruel hand. He was young, maybe a few years older than her. His face was pale and hollow, the skin stretched tight over high cheekbones. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his clothes were little more than tattered rags. One arm was tucked awkwardly against his ribs, and blood stained the fabric around his side. He looked up at her, dazed, and for a moment Eloise saw a flash of something in his eye. Not fear, not aggression, but hunger, desperation. She swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave him to whatever fate had brought him here. She owed him nothing. No one would blame her for walking away, but she could. Something deep inside, something Jacob had loved about her, stopped her feet. The stubborn kindness she couldn't kill, no matter how much the world tried. Easing the barrel down, Eloise knelt beside him. "Can you move at all?" Her voice barely a whisper. The man shook his head once, weakly. His lips moved, forming a word she barely caught. "Please." That single word unraveled her defenses. She slid her arm beneath his shoulders and tried to lift him, grunting with the effort. He was heavier than he looked, and dead weight from exhaustion. But somehow, through sheer will, she dragged him across the yard and into the house. She laid him down in front of the fire, quickly fetching a bowl of water and the few bandages she had left. He barely stirred, only shivering once when she peeled back the bloodied shirt to reveal a deep, angry gash across his ribs. As she worked, cleaning and binding the wound. He finally spoke again, his voice little more than a breath. "Name's Rhett Callahan." Eloise met his eyes, steady and quiet. "I'm Eloise," she said, tightening the bandage with careful hands. Rhett Callahan gave a faint nod before slipping into unconsciousness, and as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Eloise sat back and stared at the stranger sleeping on her floor. She couldn't have guessed it then, but by giving shelter to a starving outlaw, she had just changed the course of her life forever. Morning broke cold and brittle, the sky smeared with shades of pale gray. Eloise sat by the fire, bleary-eyed, clutching a chipped mug of coffee gone cold hours ago. She had barely slept, half her mind listening for trouble, the other half questioning her own sanity. The man, Rhett Callahan, still lay where she had placed him, wrapped in the old quilt that had once belonged to her grandmother. His breathing was shallow but steady, and the fever that had flushed his cheeks during the night seemed to have cooled. Eloise studied him carefully now in the light of day. There was something wild about him, something restless even in sleep. His face bore the signs of hardship, old scars, sun-browned skin, a fresh cut along his jaw. Not the face of a man accustomed to kindness, not the face of a man used to being safe. The thought gnawed at her. What kind of life drove a man to collapse in a stranger's barn in the dead of night? She didn't have long to wonder. A distant sound caught her ear, the sharp crack of hooves on dry dirt. More than one horse coming fast. Eloise's blood ran cold. Without thinking, she rushed to the window and peered out. Down the road, a cloud of dust rose as half a dozen riders thundered toward her property, dark figures against the pale morning. Her first thought was that they were raiders, one of the bands of desperate men who roamed the countryside, stealing what little others had managed to cling to. Her second thought, more chilling, was that they were looking for him. Rhett Callahan stirred at the noise, his eyes flickering open. He grimaced, struggling to sit up, but Eloise pushed him gently back down. "Stay still," she whispered. The horses skidded to a stop just beyond the rear front gate. Men dismounted, spreading out, rifles loose in their hands but not raised. They didn't look like a lynch mob. They looked organized. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, stepped forward and called out, "We're looking for our brother," he shouted, voice carrying over the barren fields. "We mean no harm to the lady of the house." Brother? Eloise's mind raced. Was Rhett Callahan truly part of a gang? Had she just thrown her lot in with criminals? Rhett Callahan groaned, softly behind her. She turned to see his face pale with fear, not for himself but for her. "They're mine," he rasped. "They'll hurt you if they think you're hiding me." Eloise made a quick decision. She grabbed the rifle leaning by the door, cradling it in her arms. As she stepped onto the porch, the wind tugged at her skirts, but she stood tall. "You say you mean no harm," she called. "Prove it." The man with the mustache smiled grimly. "We owe him," he said simply. "We owe you now too." He raised a hand and gestured. Slowly the men began forming a perimeter around her farm, like a living shield. Confused, Eloise glanced back at Rhett Callahan. He struggled to sit up, managing a weak smile. "You saved me," he said. "That makes you family." Family. The word hit her harder than any bullet. For so long she had fought to survive alone, clinging to the memory of a life lost. Now, in a single night, she had crossed some invisible line and found herself surrounded by men willing to defend her with their lives. Eloise lowered the rifle slightly, feeling the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Whatever Rhett Callahan had done, whatever sins he carried, they were not hers to judge. Not yet. She turned back to the men, voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "Then you're welcome to stay," she said. "But anyone who threatens this farm will answer to me first." The mustached man tipped his hat, respect flashing in his eyes. As the morning sun climbed higher, Eloise realized that the world outside her door had changed overnight, and whether she was ready or not, her life was no longer her own. It was theirs. It was his. The day wore on, heavy with a silence that felt different than before. Not the lonely silence Eloise had grown used to, but something alive and alert, waiting stillness that settled over the land like a warning. Rhett Callahan slept fitfully by the fire, his breathing rough but steady. Outside, the riders kept watch, circling the farm slowly like sentinels. Eloise watched them through the cracked window pane, the rifle never far from reach. She wasn't naive. Men like these didn't risk themselves for nothing, and no outlaw, no matter how grateful, protected a stranger without a cost. She stirred the thin stew simmering over the fire and tried to banish the thought. There was no sense borrowing trouble, not yet. By late afternoon, Rhett Callahan woke again, stronger this time. He sat up slowly, groaning as his muscles protested. "You should be resting," Eloise said, bringing him a tin cup of water. He accepted it with a grateful nod, his fingers brushing hers. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through her, warm and disorienting. "Can't rest too long," he muttered, glancing toward the door. "Trouble don't wait." "You expect it to come?" she asked quietly. Red Callahan's jaw tightened. "Always does." He sipped the water, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You're braver than most," he said, studying her with eyes too old for his face. "Most folks would have left me to die." "I thought about it," Eloise said truthfully. Red Callahan gave a low chuckle, a sound more rusted than amused. "Smart," he said. "Would have been safer." Eloise shook her head. "I'm done hiding behind caution." The words surprised even her, but they felt true. For too long she had lived with her heart locked away, surviving but not living. Something about this man, this broken, dangerous man, had cracked that shell without even trying. Before either could speak again, a sharp whistle echoed from outside. Red Callahan stiffened, struggling to rise. Eloise helped him to his feet, and together they peered out the window. Another group of riders was approaching, this time not Red Callahan's men. Their horses kicked up dust, and their rifles gleamed menacingly. In the dying light there were more of them than before, and these men rode with a different posture. Aggressive. Red Callahan cursed under his breath. "Mercs," he said. "Bounty hunters. They're here for me." Eloise felt fear coil in her stomach, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Can your men handle them?" she asked. Red Callahan hesitated. "They'll try, but these mercs don't play fair." He turned to her, something like apology in his gaze. "You don't owe me anything," he said roughly. "If you tell them you didn't know who I was, they might spare you." Eloise's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to send him away, to save herself and her farm. But when she looked into Red Callahan's eyes, so full of regret and defiance, she knew she couldn't. "I gave you shelter," she said, "and I don't go back on my word." Outside, the mercenaries were dismounting, spreading out like wolves scenting blood. Red Callahan gritted his teeth. "Then we stand together," he said. He reached for the pistol tucked into his belt, the only weapon he had left, and checked the cylinder. "Stay inside," he told her. "If they breach the house, shoot first. Don't hesitate." Eloise nodded, forcing down the terror rising in her throat. The first shout rang out, sharp and commanding. "Send out the outlaw woman. Hand him over and we'll let you live." Red Callahan's hand brushed her shoulder, brief, firm, almost tender. "I'm sorry," he said. Before she could answer, he stepped onto the porch, facing the mercenaries with nothing but a pistol and a battered body. Eloise gripped the rifle tighter and prayed for strength, for courage, for whatever it would take to survive the night. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of smoke and fear across the dying fields. The battle for her farm, and her future, had begun. The first gunshot split the air like a lightning strike. Eloise flinched instinctively, the sound echoing off the hills, sharp and cruel. Through the window, she saw Red Callahan fire back, calm, deliberate, even though his body still leaned heavily against the porch beam for support. The mercenaries answered in a brutal chorus of gunfire. Bullets tore into the dirt, the fence posts, the walls of the barn. One round slammed into the side of the farmhouse, showering Eloise with splinters. She dropped to the floor, heart hammering against her ribs, clutching the rifle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Outside, Red Callahan's men, those rough dust-streaked brothers who had pledged to protect her, fought back fiercely. From behind overturned wagons from the shadows of the barn, they returned fire with the grim efficiency of men who had nothing left to lose. The farm had become a battlefield. Eloise crawled to the edge of window and peered out. The mercenaries were better armed, better fed, but Red Callahan's men knew the land, knew how to use every broken fence, every patch of tall grass for cover. Still, the numbers were against. Red Callahan ducked behind the porch column, reloading with hands that shook from blood loss and exhaustion. One of his men, a wiry young man with a bandana around his neck, fell to a bullet crumpling in the dust without a sound. Eloise swallowed back a scream. She had lived through grief. She had buried a husband. She thought she understood loss, but watching men fight and die on her land, men dying because she had shown kindness to a stranger, was a different kind of horror. Another shout rang out, closer this time. Two mercenaries broke from their ranks, sprinting toward the farmhouse with wild, reckless abandon. One carried a torch. They weren't just trying to kill Red Callahan, they wanted to burn everything down. Eloise didn't hesitate. She rose from the floor, bracing the rifle against the windowsill the way Jacob had taught her years ago, back when they would spend lazy afternoons target shooting by the creek. She sighted the man with the torch first, held her breath, pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot was deafening in the small house. The man stumbled, dropped the torch, and fell face first into the dirt. The second man hesitated, just enough for Rhett Callahan to step from cover and fire a single clean shot into his chest. The danger passed, but only for a moment. The torch lay smoldering in the dust, dangerously close to the dry grass. If it caught, the whole farm would go up in flames. Rhett Callahan limped toward it, stomping it out with swift, vicious kicks, grimacing with each movement. When he straightened, he locked eyes with Eloise through the window. He gave a small nod, a thank you, silent but full of weight. She nodded back, throat tight. Another lull settled over the battlefield, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the far-off cries of birds disturbed by the chaos. The mercenaries regrouped, pulling back slightly, reassessing. Rhett Callahan leaned heavily against the porch rail, breathing hard. He didn't look like a leader now. He looked like a man held together by stubbornness and sheer will. Eloise grabbed another handful of bullets from the small box Jacob had kept tucked away for emergencies, bullets she had hoped never to use. She loaded the rifle again, hands steady now. There was no room for fear anymore, only resolve. Outside, the leader of the mercenaries barked new orders. Their next move would be harder, faster. Rhett Callahan's men tightened their lines, preparing for the inevitable. Eloise pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled in her arms. Rhett Callahan turned to her, surprise flickering across his bruised face. "You don't have to," he rasped. "I know," she said. They stood side by side, a broken outlaw and a stubborn widow, facing down the storm together. No words could capture the weight of that moment. No words were needed. As the sun sank lower and the wind picked up once more, Eloise realized that whatever happened next, whether they lived or died, she had already made her choice. She would fight for her home. She would fight for the life she still believed in, and she would fight for him. The second attack came at twilight. The mercenaries, having regrouped, launched themselves at the farm, with the desperate rage of men who smelled blood. No more cautious advances, no more shouted warnings. Just a brutal full-force assault meant to crush whatever resistance remained. The evening sky bled orange and purple as the first shots rang out. Eloise stood on the porch, shoulder to shoulder with Rhett Callahan. The heavy rifle braced against her body. The kick of the weapon jolted through her with every shot she fired. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Rhett Callahan, though pale and swaying on his feet, moved with the grim precision of a man long used to fighting against the odds. Each time he fired, a mercenary fell or scattered into cover. Rhett Callahan's men fought fiercely from behind bales of hay, broken wagons, and the stone well at the center of the yard, but the enemy pressed harder. A bullet whistled past Eloise's, ears splintering the porch beam inches from her head. Rhett Callahan pulled her down instinctively, shielding her with his body. "You're a damn fool," he muttered hoarsely. Eloise gave a breathless laugh. "Takes one to know one." For a moment there was nothing but the two of them, crouched together behind the battered wood, hearts pounding in unison. Then the world exploded again in a roar of gunfire. From the edge of her vision, Eloise saw smoke rising, not from the torch she had shot earlier, but from the barn itself. A new fire set by one of the mercenaries under cover of battle. The barn, the last of her supplies, the last of the livestock, everything that stood between her and starvation, was about to be lost. "No," she cried out, shoving free of Rhett Callahan's grip. He tried to grab her, but she was already running, dodging gunfire, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The barn door was ajar, smoke billowing out. She plunged inside, coughing against the thick, acrid air. The old mare, Jacob's horse, whinnied in terror, rearing against her rope. "Easy, girl, easy," Eloise croaked, fumbling with the knot. Flames licked along the far wall, creeping faster than she could move. Finally the rope gave way. Eloise slapped the mare's flank, sending her bolting into the yard. The heat seared her skin as she stumbled back, vision swimming. Strong hands grabbed her around the waist and hauled her bodily out of the barn just as the roof groaned and collapsed in a shower of sparks. Rhett Callahan, he carried her away from the blaze, coughing and swearing under his breath, until they collapsed, behind the safety of the well. "You're insane," he rasped. Eloise coughed hard, trying to clear her lungs. "You're welcome," she wheezed. Rhett Callahan gave a rough, broken laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. Blood seeped through the bandages on his side again. The fire roared behind them, consuming the barn in a tidal wave of orange light. But the mare was safe. The farmhouse was still standing, and the mercenaries, startled by the sudden inferno, hesitated. It was enough. Rhett Callahan's men seized the moment, pressing the advantage with fierce, desperate assault. Within minutes, the mercenaries realized the cost of their ambition. One by one, they fled, some dragging wounded comrades behind them, others galloping away and disappearing into the deepening twilight. When the last of them was gone, a terrible silence settled over the land. No more gunfire, no more shouting, only the crackle of the burning barn and the labored breathing of the wounded. Eloise sat slumped against the well, trembling with exhaustion. Rhett Callahan sagged beside her, eyes closed, chest heaving. "You should have left me," he muttered after a long moment. Eloise turned her head to look at him, tears stinging her smoke-reddened eyes. "I'm tired of leaving," she said softly. The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded. Rhett Callahan opened his eyes and studied her, really studied her for the first time. Whatever he saw there made something in his expression soften just for a heartbeat. But then he turned away, jaw tight, guarding himself again. Eloise didn't push. She understood walls. She had built enough of her own to recognize them in others. Instead, she sat quietly beside him as the last light faded. Two broken souls bound together by blood, fire, and the stubborn, foolish act of offering shelter to a stranger. And somewhere deep inside her chest, past the fear and the sorrow, a tiny spark caught flame. Hope. The next morning, the farm looked like a battlefield long after the fighting had stopped. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the pale sky, its charred beams creaking in the cold breeze. The yard was scarred with hoof prints, bullet holes, and the quiet markers of the night's violence. But the farmhouse still stood, and so did Eloise. She pushed through the ruins with quiet resolve, dragging broken boards into piles, checking on the surviving animals, gathering what supplies had not burned. Her muscles screamed in protest, her hands blistered and raw, but she didn't stop. Rhett Callahan sat on the porch, his arm wrapped tight against his wounded side, watching her work with a haunted expression. He should have been resting, but resting meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering things he had spent years trying to bury. As the sun rose higher, Eloise finally dropped the last armful of debris and wiped the sweat from her brow. "You're bleeding again," she called to him, her voice rough but steady. Rhett Callahan shrugged, wincing at the movement. "Had worse." Eloise didn't argue. Instead, she disappeared inside the house and returned with fresh bandages and a bottle of whiskey. "Come here," she ordered. Rhett Callahan hesitated, pride flickering across his face. But something in her tone, unyielding, kind, familiar, made him. He sat heavily on the steps while she knelt beside him, peeling back the soaked bandages with careful fingers. The wound was ugly, angry red around the stitches. She dabbed it clean, ignoring his grunts of pain. "You're lucky you're, stubborn," she said, "or you'd be dead." Rhett Callahan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Luck's never been much on my side." He fell silent, watching her work. There was a strange intimacy in it, the way her hands moved with firm, gentle purpose. No judgment, no fear, only care. For a man like Rhett Callahan, it was almost unbearable. "You should know," he said, voice low, "why they were really after me." Eloise paused but didn't look up. "I figured it wasn't just bad luck," she said. Rhett Callahan stared out at the ruined barn, gathering words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "I used to wear a badge," he said finally, "Deputy Marshal out of Abilene." Eloise's head snapped up, surprise flashing in her eyes. He repeated, bitterly, "until I found out the men I worked for were dirtier than the outlaws we hunted." He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. "They framed me, said I stole money from the evidence lockup, said I was dirty, turned me into the very thing I hated." His voice cracked, raw with old wounds. "They put a price on my head. Better to hunt me down than let me speak." Eloise finished tying off the fresh bandage and sat back on her heels, studying him. "You could have run," she said quietly. "Left the territory, started over." Rhett Callahan shook his head. "Running don't change what you are." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the burned-out fields and the soft creak of the porch under their weight. Eloise reached out slowly and placed her hand over his. "You're not what they say," she said firmly. "I see who you are." Rhett Callahan looked down at their joined hands, as if seeing something foreign, something he didn't know how to. The words hung between them, fragile and real. Rhett Callahan turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and for the first time in years, the weight he carried didn't feel quite so heavy. They sat there together as the day warmed, two wounded souls stitched together not by blood or obligation but by something stronger. Trust, hope, a fragile beginning rising from the ashes. 2 days passed. The farm was quieter now, but it wasn't peace that hung in the air. It was tension, thick and waiting, like a storm that hadn't decided whether to strike or pass. Rhett Callahan recovered slowly, spending his mornings helping Eloise rebuild what they could. Simple things: repairing the fence, hauling water, salvaging tools from the burned barn. Tasks that demanded little talk, but somehow said more than words ever could. At night they sat by the fire, speaking in low tones about the future, about what might come if the world allowed them to dream again. But the world, Eloise knew, rarely allowed such things. On the third morning, while Rhett Callahan was reinforcing the chicken coop, a rider appeared on the road. Eloise spotted him first, a lone figure kicking up dust. As he approached at a measured, deliberate pace, she stepped onto the porch, shotgun cradled loosely in her arms. Rhett Callahan falling into place. Beside her, the rider slowed, raised a hand in greeting, and stopped a safe distance from the gate. He was older, with a grizzled beard and the wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. His clothes were worn, but his horse was fine, a sign of a man used to traveling far and fast. "I come with a message," he called out. Eloise and Rhett Callahan exchanged a look. The man dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, and pulled a folded scrap of paper from his coat. "Town council sent me," he said, voice gravelly. "They know about the fight, about you," he added, nodding at Rhett Callahan. The paper fluttered in the breeze as he held it out. Rhett Callahan moved first, limping down the steps to take it. He unfolded it carefully. Eloise watched his face tighten as he read. "What does it say?" she asked. Rhett Callahan's jaw clenched. "They're offering a deal," he said, voice low. "Leave this farm, leave the county, and they won't come after us." "And if we stay?" Eloise asked. The messenger shifted uncomfortably. "They'll come themselves," he said. "Sheriff's gathering a posse, big one." Silence fell. The only sound was the restless stamping of the messenger's horse. Eloise felt the weight of it settle in her chest, a familiar heavy pressure. She had spent so long fighting to survive, clawing her way through one loss after another. Now that she had finally found something, someone worth fighting for, the world demanded she give it up. Rhett Callahan crumpled the paper in his fist. "We're not running," he said quietly. Eloise didn't hesitate. "Then neither am I." The messenger sighed as if he had expected nothing less. He mounted his horse again. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "That's when they'll come." He tipped his hat. "I'm sorry." Then he rode away, leaving only dust and dread behind him. Rhett Callahan stood for a long moment, shoulders tense. Eloise moved to his side, slipping her hand into his. "We'll find a way," she said. He shook his head grimly. "They'll bring more men than we can fight. Guns we can't match. We have something they don't," she said. Rhett Callahan turned, frowning. "Faith," she whispered, "and a reason worth fighting for." He stared at her, and something unspoken passed between them, something deeper than the fear, stronger than the threat on the horizon. Together they began making preparation. They reinforced the farmhouse, boarded the windows, dug shallow trenches where the earth would allow. Rhett Callahan's remaining men, those still able to fight, returned when word spread of the coming battle. They didn't ask for payment. They didn't ask for promises. They came because of Rhett Callahan, because of Eloise, because some debts are repaid not in gold, but in loyalty and blood. That night, as the sun sank and the land turned to shadow, Eloise sat beside Rhett Callahan on the steps of the farmhouse. The stars blinked to life above them, cold and distant. He took her hand, rough fingers lacing with hers. "If this is the end," he said quietly, "I'm glad it's with you." Eloise leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling his warmth, his strength. "It's not the end," she whispered. "Not if we believe it isn't." Above them, the wind stirred, the dying embers of the world they were fighting to save. The morning sun rose thin and pale, casting long, sharp shadows across the wounded land. It was the kind of light that made everything feel exposed. Every weakness, every hope laid bare. Eloise moved through the house with methodical precision, checking the barricades, counting the few precious rounds of ammunition left. Her hands were steady, her heart quiet. There was no room left for fear now. Only Rhett Callahan and the others worked outside, reinforcing the trenches, positioning themselves where cover was strongest. Every man wore the same grim expression, the look of those who had already counted the odds and chosen to stand anyway. From the porch, Eloise could see the dust cloud rising in the distance. They were coming, the town's men, ranchers, merchants, lawmen, riding with the weight of authority and the righteousness of the mob. They came not just for Rhett Callahan, but for the idea of him, the outlaw who had dared to survive, and for her, the woman who had dared to offer kindness. Eloise knew what they expected to find here: fear, surrender, They would find neither. Red Callahan approached the porch, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked exhausted, the wound in his side pulling at him with every step, but his eyes burned with fierce, stubborn life. "Ready?" he asked. Eloise nodded. "More ready than I've ever been." He gave a small smile, soft, almost sad. "I should have left the night you found me," he said, voice rough. "You'd be dead," she replied. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I wouldn't have dragged you into this." Eloise stepped closer, reaching up to touch his cheek. "You didn't drag me," she said. Simple words, but they held the weight of everything she had lost, and everything she had dared to hope for again. Red Callahan closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her touch like a man starving for something he didn't know he needed. Footsteps approached. One of Red Callahan's men, face grim. "They're close," he said. Red Callahan straightened, his hand brushing Eloise's before stepping back into the role he knew too well. Leader, protector, fighter. He barked quick orders, tightening the defenses, ensuring everyone knew their place. Eloise took up her position inside the farmhouse, near the front window, rifle resting on the sill. She could see them clearly now. At least 24 riders, rifles slung across their backs, pistols gleaming in morning light. At their head rode Sheriff Miles Harlan, a broad-shouldered man with a hard face and colder eyes, the symbol of a law that had long since forgotten mercy. The riders fanned out surrounding the farm, cutting off any path of escape. Eloise's pulse remained steady. She thought of Jacob, of the dreams they had once built together on this land, and she thought of Red Callahan, of the broken man who had stumbled into her life and reminded her that survival was not the same as living. She would not lose this again. Sheriff Miles Harlan called out, his voice booming across the fields. "Hand over the outlaw, and the woman and the rest of you can go free." A beat of silence followed. Red Callahan stepped onto the porch, unarmed, hands raised to show he carried no threat. His voice carried clear and strong. "We're not handing over anyone." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You're outnumbered, Dorn. Don't be stupid." Eloise moved to the doorway, rifle in hand, standing tall beside Red Callahan. Her voice rang out steady as a church bell. "You want this land? You'll have to take it." The sheriff cursed under his breath. A shot rang out, a warning, not aimed to kill, but the battle line had been drawn. Red Callahan's men raised their weapons. The sheriff's posse shifted in their highs, saddles, nerves taut. One wrong move and blood would stain the earth again. The wind picked up, tugging at Eloise's skirts, at Red Callahan's coat, twisted promises of violence, of endings. But Eloise was not afraid. Not anymore. Red Callahan glanced at her, something fierce and unbreakable in his gaze. "With me?" he asked. "Always," she said. The riders tensed, the defenders braced, and the first real shot of the battle shattered the morning. The morning erupted in chaos. The sheriff's men surged forward with a roar, rifles cracking, pistols flashing in the cold light. Red Callahan's defenders, though fewer in number, answered with precision and grit born of desperation. Eloise fired from the window, heart pounding, but hand steady. Each shot was deliberate, measured. She was no gunslinger, but she fought like someone with everything to lose. Bullets tore through the air, slamming into walls, kicking up dirt, splintering wood. The farmhouse shuddered under the assault, but it held. Outside, Red Callahan moved like a man possessed. Despite the pain etched into his every step, he led the defense with fierce determination, calling out orders, returning fire with deadly aim. He fought not for glory, not for revenge, but for the fragile thread of a life he had only just begun to leave in for Eloise. The sheriff's men pressed harder, circling the farmhouse, trying to find a weakness. A group of 3 broke off, making a run for the side door. Eloise pivoted, firing quickly. One fell, another stumbled. The third made it to the porch but was met by Red Callahan himself, who tackled the man hard, wresting the gun from his grasp before knocking him unconscious with the butt of his own pistol. More gunfire erupted from the far end of the field. Red Callahan's men, those who could still stand, fought with brutal efficiency, using the trenches and barricades to slow the attackers, but they were outnumbered. A bullet slammed into the wall just inches from Eloise's head, showering her with splinters. She ducked, hard hammering before rising again to return fire. Outside, Red Callahan spotted Sheriff Miles Harlan, riding forward, shouting orders, urging his men on. The sheriff believed this would end quickly, believed their will to resist would break. He didn't understand. He had underestimated what people would fight for when they had nothing left to fear. Red Callahan moved through the smoke and gunfire, making his way toward the sheriff. Every step was agony, but he didn't falter. He wouldn't allow the man who threatened Eloise to leave this place unpunished. Sheriff Miles Harlan spotted him too late. Rhett Callahan fired once. Clean. Deliberate. The sheriff reeled in his saddle, then toppled to the ground, clutching his side. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The sheriff's men faltered, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. Eloise seized the moment. She stepped onto the porch, rifle raised high, voice ringing out with a force she didn't know she possessed. "Go home," she shouted. "This fight is over." For a long, terrible second, no one moved. Then one by one, the sheriff's men began to fall back, some dragging wounded comrades, others throwing down their weapons in surrender. The battle was over. The farm was scarred, the land soaked with blood, but it stood. Rhett Callahan staggered toward Eloise, blood staining his shirt, a grimace twisting his face. She rushed to him, catching his weight as his knees buckled. "I'm fine," he rasped, though his body told a different story. "You're a terrible liar," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. Carefully she helped him inside, laying him down on the couch by the fire. The surviving defenders trickled in, battered but alive. Some collapsed onto chairs, others tended to the wounded in silence. There were no cheers, no celebration, only the exhausted, profound relief of those who had dared to defy fate and won. Eloise pressed a clean cloth against Rhett Callahan's side, trying to staunch the bleeding. His hand found hers, gripping it tightly. "You saved me," he murmured. She shook her head, tears slipping free. "No," she said. "We saved each other." Rhett Callahan smiled, a small broken smile but real. Around them, the farmhouse, what was left of it, stood firm against the ruins. And for the first time in a long while, Eloise believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting beyond the wreckage. The days that followed moved slowly, stitched together by exhaustion and fragile hope. The wounded healed as best they could. The dead were buried under the lone cottonwood tree at the edge of the farm, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses carved by Eloise's hand. There was no priest to say words over them, only the wind, the dust, and the quiet promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The townsfolk kept their distance. With Sheriff Miles Harlan gone, and their men broken, they had little stomach left for more fighting. Some even sent quiet offerings, tools, seed, spare lumber, left at the fence line like peace offerings from a guilty conscience. The farm, scarred and battered, began to breathe again. The fences were rebuilt. A new barn, smaller but sturdy, rose from the ashes. The well was deepened. The fields, once choked by drought and fear, were plowed anew. Eloise worked from dawn till dusk, the sun baking her skin, the earth grinding into her hands. And Rhett Callahan was always there, silent, steady, mending what he could, carrying what she could not. They spoke little of the battle, of the blood spilled on their soil. Some things lived better in silence. Instead, they built a new rhythm between them, something careful, tender, and fiercely strong. It wasn't the life either of them had once imagined. It was better. One evening, weeks after the last of the mercenaries had vanished like smoke into the hills, Rhett Callahan stood at the edge of the porch, watching the sun sink behind the broken horizon. Eloise joined him, wiping her hands on her apron. The sky was ablaze with color, gold crimson, the soft purple of twilight. A good omen, she thought. Rhett Callahan turned to her, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. "I'm thinking of staying," he said, voice rough. Eloise's heart skipped a beat. "You could go," she said carefully. "Start fresh somewhere. No one knows your name." He shook his head. "Names don't mean much," he said. "People do." She swallowed, hard, the weight of all they had endured settling in her chest. "I can't pay you much," she said, half smiling. "Hard work, bad pay, stubborn company." Rhett Callahan smiled, truly smiled, for the first time. "Sounds like the best offer I ever had." He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, until there was nothing left but the quiet beat of two hearts that had survived the impossible. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hand. Eloise leaned into his touch without hesitation. When he kissed her, it wasn't the desperate, reckless kiss of men who didn't know if they'd see tomorrow. It was the kiss of survivors, of builders, of two broken souls who had found something worth mending in each other. When they pulled apart, the world felt different, smaller, and somehow more infinite at the same time. Home. That's what it was. Not the land, not the walls. Each other. Rhett Callahan pressed his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "I never had a place to belong," he whispered. "You do now," she said. They stood together as the stars blinked awake in the endless sky, the earth cooling beneath their feet, the promise of a new life rising quiet and strong between them. And though the world beyond their fence would always carry its dangers, its cruelty, its storms. They were no longer afraid. They had each other, guarded by the dust and sky. Sometimes the strongest homes are not built from wood and stone, but from trust, courage, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words mean more than you know. And if you believe in stories that heal and inspire, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys like this one. Until next time, stay strong and stay kind.